At 2:15 p.m. on February 8, 2026, President Trump stood in the East Room of the White House and delivered what historians will likely classify as the most audacious demand ever made by one democratic nation to another in peacetime. He stated that Canada should seriously consider joining the United States as either a collection of states or as a single unified state, that this merger would benefit both nations economically and strategically, and that if Canada refused to engage in serious discussions about political integration, the United States would have no choice but to treat Canada as it would treat any other foreign adversary. Full economic isolation, total cessation of trade, complete severance of security cooperation. The border, he said, would become what it should have been all along, a real border between separate nations with separate interests. This was not a casual comment. This was not an offhand remark that could be walked back by staff or reinterpreted as a negotiating tactic. Trump read from prepared remarks. The statement was coordinated with senior cabinet officials who stood behind him, nodding in agreement. Secretary of State Marco Rubio followed with his own statement, arguing that Canadian sovereignty in its current form is a historical accident that no longer serves anyone's interests. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent presented economic projections showing how integration would create immediate GDP growth for both nations. And National Security Advisor Mike Waltz described the current situation as untenable, stating that the United States cannot continue to share the longest undefended border in the world with a nation that has demonstrated it will act against American interests when it suits them. The message was coordinated, deliberate, and absolute. Canada's options are integration or isolation. There is no third path. The immediate justification Trump provided centers on Canada's seizure of American assets and what he described as their refusal to negotiate in good faith. He argued that a nation willing to confiscate $180 billion in American property, willing to threaten American energy security, and willing to undermine the relationship that has sustained both countries for generations, cannot be trusted to remain an independent actor. Therefore, he said, the only logical solution is to eliminate the distinction between the two nations entirely. If Canada becomes part of the United States, the asset dispute becomes irrelevant. The resources both nations depend on would be under unified control. The political tensions would dissolve, and North America would finally achieve the integration that geography and economics have always suggested was inevitable. But beneath this framing lies something far more fundamental. What Trump is actually proposing is the annexation of a sovereign nation, packaged in the language of voluntary merger and mutual benefit. He is demanding that Canada surrender its independence, dissolve its government, abandon its political identity, and submit to American authority. And he is threatening total economic destruction if they refuse. This is not a negotiation. This is an ultimatum backed by the implicit threat of force, and it represents the complete abandonment of every principle that has governed relations between democratic nations since the end of World War II. The historical context makes the audacity of this demand even clearer. The United States and Canada have been separate nations since Canadian Confederation in 1867. Before that, Canada existed as British colonies that explicitly rejected joining the American Republic during and after the Revolutionary War. Loyalists fled north to avoid becoming part of the United States. The War of 1812 was fought partly over American attempts to annex Canadian territory. Canadian identity was forged in opposition to American expansion. For 250 years, the defining characteristic of Canadian nationhood has been the determination to remain not American. And now, the President of the United States is declaring that this distinction no longer matters, that Canada's sovereignty is negotiable, and that integration is not a choice, but an inevitability that Canada can accept peacefully or face catastrophically. No American president has ever made this demand before. There have been jokes, rhetorical flourishes, casual suggestions that Canada should become the 51st state, but these were always understood as humor, as provocations designed to annoy rather than serious policy proposals. What Trump just articulated is not humor, it is policy. His administration has prepared legal frameworks for how Canadian provinces could be admitted as states. They have drafted economic integration plans. They have consulted with constitutional scholars about the mechanics of absorbing a foreign nation into the American federal system. This is not a bluff or a negotiating position. This is an actual plan that the White House expects Canada to seriously consider. The specific threats attached to the ultimatum are comprehensive and designed to leave no room for misunderstanding. If Canada refuses to engage in integration discussions within 30 days, the United States will implement what Trump called full economic separation. This means the immediate termination of USMCA, the trade agreement governing $750 billion in annual commerce between the two nations. It means the imposition of tariffs on all Canadian goods at rates to be determined, but suggested to be in the range of 100% to 200%. It means the complete cessation of all electricity exports to Canada, with no exceptions for humanitarian concerns. It means the closure of the border to all but essential travel, which Trump defined narrowly as American citizens returning home. The security dimension is equally severe. The United States would withdraw from all bilateral defense agreements with Canada. NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that has protected North American airspace since 1958, would be dissolved or restructured to exclude Canadian participation. Intelligence sharing would end. Joint military exercises would cease. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which includes the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, would become Four Eyes. Canada would be treated as a security risk rather than as the closest ally. And perhaps most significantly, Trump stated that the United States would no longer guarantee Canadian sovereignty against threats from other powers. If Russia decides to assert claims in the Arctic, if China moves to expand its influence through investment and pressure, the United States will not intervene. The financial warfare would extend beyond trade. Trump announced that all Canadian assets held in American financial institutions would be frozen pending resolution of the asset seizure dispute. Canadian citizens would be prohibited from accessing American banking services. Credit card networks operating in Canada would be instructed to terminate services. The SWIFT international banking system, which is heavily dependent on American cooperation, would be pressured to limit Canadian access. The goal is clear: make it impossible for Canada to function as an independent economy. Strangle them financially until integration becomes the only viable path to survival. Prime Minister Carney's response came within 2 hours. He stood before Parliament and delivered what may be the defining speech of his political career. He called Trump's demand an insult to every Canadian who has ever lived and an attack on the very concept of national sovereignty. He stated that Canada will never, under any circumstances, surrender its independence to the United States. He described the integration proposal as annexation dressed in the rhetoric of partnership, and declared that Canada would rather face economic hardship than submit to foreign control. The chamber erupted in applause. Every opposition party leader stood to express support. The message to Washington was unambiguous. The answer is no, not now, not ever. But Carney's defiance, however politically necessary, does not change the brutal mathematics of Canada's position. The Canadian economy is fundamentally dependent on access to American markets. 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Major industries, automotive, energy, agriculture, forestry, all rely on cross-border supply chains that have been built over decades. Cutting off that access would trigger immediate economic collapse. GDP would contract by 20% or more within the first year. Unemployment would surge into double digits. Government revenues would crater. The social safety net would disintegrate. Canada has a population of 40 million people and an economy roughly the size of Texas. The United States has 335 million people and an economy 15 times larger. In a test of economic endurance, Canada loses. The political calculation Trump appears to be making is that economic pressure will eventually fracture Canadian unity. He believes that when unemployment hits 15%, when businesses are closing, when the currency collapses, when ordinary Canadians are suffering, public opinion will shift. People will start asking why their government is choosing pride over prosperity. Regional tensions will intensify. Alberta, which already has separatist movements and closer cultural ties to the American West, might decide that joining the United States is preferable to remaining in a failing Canadian federation. British Columbia might reach a similar conclusion. Trump does not need all of Canada to agree. He just needs enough provinces to break away, and the country will collapse from within. But this analysis misreads Canadian political culture in a fundamental way. National identity is not purely economic. It is psychological, historical, cultural. Canadians define themselves in opposition to the United States, not hostile opposition, but distinct identity. Canadian healthcare, Canadian multiculturalism, Canadian peacekeeping traditions, these are not just policies, they are defining characteristics of what it means to be Canadian. The threat of American annexation is not just about losing sovereignty, it is about losing identity. And people will endure extraordinary suffering to preserve identity when they believe the alternative is cultural extinction. The international reaction has been swift and nearly unprecedented in its unity. The G7, minus the United States, issued a joint statement defending Canadian sovereignty and condemning what they called American coercion. The European Union announced emergency consultations on imposing sanctions against the United States if Trump follows through on his threats. The United Kingdom stated that any attempt to force Canada into political integration would be viewed as a violation of international law and would fundamentally alter the UK's relationship with Washington. Australia and New Zealand, the other members of Five Eyes, made clear they would continue intelligence cooperation with Canada, regardless of American preferences. The United Nations General Assembly convened a special session. The Secretary General, in carefully diplomatic language, stated that the territorial integrity and political independence of all member states must be respected, and that attempts to coerce nations into surrendering sovereignty through economic pressure violate the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. Russia and China, predictably, have seized on the crisis to argue that this proves the United States respects no law except the law of power. But the criticism is not limited to adversaries. Traditional American allies are expressing alarm, confusion, and in some cases, outright opposition. What makes this crisis so destabilizing is that it exposes the fragility of the entire international order, the system of sovereign nation-states, the principle that borders cannot be changed by force, the idea that even powerful nations must respect the independence of weaker neighbors. All of this depends on the largest powers accepting restraint. The United States has been the primary guarantor of this system since 1945, and now, the United States is openly declaring that sovereignty is conditional, that economic power can be used to force political integration, and that smaller nations must accept the preferences of larger neighbors or face destruction. If Trump succeeds, if Canada is forced into integration through economic coercion, the precedent is catastrophic. Russia will point to this moment to justify pressure on Ukraine, on the Baltic states, on any neighbor it wishes to bring back under its control. China will cite it when making demands of Taiwan, of Southeast Asian nations within its sphere of influence. The principle that sovereign nations have the right to exist independent of powerful neighbors will be dead, and the world will revert to a system where might makes right, and smaller nations exist only at the sufferance of larger ones. The economic consequences of full isolation, if Trump follows through, extend far beyond Canada. American industries are deeply integrated with Canadian supply chains. Automotive manufacturing relies on parts that cross the border multiple times during production. Energy refineries depend on Canadian crude. Agriculture depends on Canadian fertilizers and grain. Cutting these connections does not just hurt Canada. It devastates American industries, raises consumer prices, and triggers supply shortages across multiple sectors. The economic pain would be mutual, severe, and lasting. But Trump appears to believe that the United States can absorb that pain more easily than Canada can. He is betting that American voters will tolerate higher prices and economic disruption if it is framed as necessary hardship to bring Canada to heel. He is calculating that nationalist sentiment will override economic self-interest. And he may be right. The political coalition that elected him twice is built on cultural grievance and the desire to see America dominate rather than cooperate. Sacrificing prosperity for dominance is consistent with that worldview. The timeline Trump has established creates artificial urgency designed to maximize pressure. 30 days to begin integration discussions or face isolation. That deadline falls in early March, still winter in most of Canada, when economic disruption and energy shortages will hit hardest. The timing is not coincidental. It is designed to force decisions under maximum duress. But it also creates a countdown that neither leader can easily escape. If Trump sets a deadline and Canada ignores it, he must follow through or be seen as weak. If Carney negotiates under this timeline, he validates the use of coercion. The deadline itself becomes a trap for both leaders. There are only three possible outcomes. The first is that Trump backs down. He declares that Canada has made sufficient gestures toward cooperation, claims victory, and abandons the integration demand. This would require admitting that the ultimatum failed, which Trump has never been willing to do. The second outcome is that Carney capitulates. Canada agrees to some form of integration discussions to avoid economic annihilation. This would end his government, fracture the country, and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis. The third outcome is that neither side blinks. Trump imposes full isolation. Canada endures. Both economies suffer catastrophic damage, and the relationship between the two nations is destroyed permanently. The fourth possibility, the one that policymakers on both sides are quietly discussing but cannot say publicly, is that this escalates beyond economics into something darker. If Canada faces genuine existential threat, if the government believes that American actions threaten the survival of the nation, military options that seemed unthinkable become thinkable. Canada cannot win a military confrontation with the United States, but Canada can make occupation impossibly costly. They can destroy infrastructure the United States depends on. They can make the northern border an active conflict zone. This outcome seems insane given the history of peaceful relations. But 6 weeks ago, the idea that the United States would demand Canadian annexation also seemed insane. The constraints that prevent escalation are dissolving faster than anyone anticipated. What Trump has done is force every nation in the world to ask a question they thought had been answered 80 years ago. Does sovereignty still mean anything? Can a nation exist independently if a more powerful neighbor decides that independence is inconvenient? Is international law anything more than words powerful nations invoke when it suits them and ignore when it does not? The answers to these questions will define the rest of the 21st century. And right now, the United States is providing answers that suggest the international order is not evolving. It is collapsing. Canada is not going to surrender. The political will does not exist. The cultural identity is too strong. The historical memory of fighting to remain independent is too deeply embedded. But Canada also cannot win an economic war with the United States. They can survive, they can endure, but they cannot force Washington to back down. Which means this crisis has no resolution that leaves both sides whole. Someone will break. Something will shatter. And when it does, the relationship that has been the most successful bilateral partnership in modern history will be gone. The trust, the cooperation, the integration, all of it built over generations and destroyed in weeks because one leader decided that partnership was weakness and that dominance was worth any cost. The 30-day clock is running, the deadline approaches, and two nations are heading toward a confrontation that neither fully controls and that both will regret regardless of who claims victory when the rubble stops falling.